Stephen Biller is Associate Professor of Biological Sciences at Wellesley College. Steve obtained his BA at Williams College and his PhD at Stanford University. At Wellesley, he teaches courses on introductory cellular and molecular biology, genetics, genomics, and bioinformatics. His research centers around the marine cyanobacterium Prochlorococcus, the smallest and most abundant photosynthetic organism on the planet. Outside of his lab and teaching, he enjoys running around with his kids, exploring the outdoors, woodworking, baseball, and music. So I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting talk, and it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Biller to New Hampshire Healthy Climate. Steve?
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thank you all for having me and for again for taking time to hear all about this really fascinating organism. So today I want to really talk to you broadly about sort of the important connections between ocean health and human health. Going to spend a little bit of time just introducing you to kind of the world of marine microbes and about all the amazing things they do to help humans survive in many different ways on this planet. Tell you a little bit more specifically about my favorite microbe called Prochlorococcus, which is really one of the most important organisms on the planet. I'll try and convince you why that is, and help you sort of understand why it's so fascinating to us. And then talk a little bit about how human impacts, through climate change and other kinds of pollution and other kinds of impacts are of changing kind of ocean microbes and what that might mean, and how we might be able to sort of use these microbes as kind of allies to kind of help us kind of with climate change related issues going forward. So I wanted to start out with this quote from Sylvia Earle that I like quite a lot, which is that, even if you never have the chance to see or touch the ocean touches you with every breath you take, every drop of water you drink, every bite you consume. Everyone everywhere is inextricably connected to and utterly dependent upon the existence of the sea. Even when you're, far, far away from the ocean, it is really important to you and how you are able to be on this planet. And for it can touch us in a lot of different ways. So ultimately, the oceans are an essential part of the lungs of our planet. So I'll speak more about this in a minute. But without the oceans, we would not be here. They're essential for the basic life support system of our planet. Not only that, they help to regulate our weather. Right? We also use the oceans as a food source, right? So lots of people are very dependent on ocean protein and other nutrients to help them meet their daily needs. Oceans have also helped us to mitigate the worst potential impacts of climate change so far. We'll talk a little bit more about what some of that might, look like. But we'd be in much worse shape right now without the oceans. Oceans are also sources of new medicines. There's an incredible amount of biodiversity and unexplored genetic potential out in the oceans, all these organisms that are being kind of investigated, both to help kind of teach us about how life works, and also as sources of potential new treatments, new insights that guide biomedical research. Oceans can also be a source of clean energy through hydropower, wind power, tidal power. All of these things are potential ways that oceans can kind of help us going forward. Oceans also play huge economic roles, right? So whether it's tourism, shipping, other kinds of coastal industries, these are playing huge roles in kind of everything, from what you get at the store to the broader functioning of our country. So when I ask you to kind of picture ocean life, right? In your mind's eye, what do you think of? Give you a second to sort of picture something. Maybe it's something like this, right? You've got a coral reef or a bunch of fish or some other whales, whatever it might be. right? We all can kind of picture some of these, diverse kinds of organisms that are found throughout the oceans. But what I think about more in my work is all the stuff that you can't see in this picture, all the tiny microorganisms that are letting all of, these beautiful fish and corals and everything else survive in the first place. So if you look at some seawater, right, and pull in just a tiny drop of, a single milliliter of that seawater, what you'll find is something on the order of 1 million different bacteria in there. And that's further dwarfed by about 10 million different viruses. Not necessarily viruses that are going to hurt us, viruses that are infecting and, and playing parts of these life cycles in the ocean and impacting these microbes. Right, so these are huge, huge numbers, and the numbers of bacteria in the ocean greatly dwarf the numbers of the more charismatic megafauna, like great white sharks or other things that get their own week of TV, for better or worse. But in the end, it's really a microbial habitat. Right? It's not all just these macrofauna out there. It's all these tiny microbes that every time you touch the seawater are playing a vital role in making that habitat survivable. So microbes are really thought of as this unseen majority in the oceans. So this is a false color image. They're not quite this bright and colorful in practice, but what you can see are all these amazing shapes and sizes of microbes that are out there, again, in every single drop of ocean across, 70% of the surface area of our planet. Ultimately, these are incredibly diverse, incredibly complicated ecosystems of interrelated and interacting organisms that together make up about 2/3 of the total biomass of the ocean, right? So that's an incredible amount of material when you think of the fact that, again, we need specialized microscopes and other kind of instruments to see them. So, when we think about a healthcare setting, right, bacteria by and large typically have a pretty bad reputation, right? So we think about all kinds of different diseases, from, malaria to, cholera and measles, everything in between that can infect people, right? Or, foodborne diseases, right? Different listeria pathogens or salmonella outbreaks, in different food sources that lead to, food recalls and people having to be sent to the ER, right? So we have all these antibacterial soaps and, Lysol disinfectants and other things like that that we use. Put that a little bit of perspective, there's something on the order of about 1,400 different microorganisms that are known to be pathogenic to humans. But there's probably something more closer to the order of 1 trillion different microbes on the planet, right? All of these are actually really critical for life. I have a very good friend from elementary school days who went on to become an infectious disease doctor. I talked to him at one point and mentioned that, oh, had become a microbiologist. And his first question to me was, oh, what disease do you study? And I had to say, well, I'm not studying a disease. I'm studying all the things that actually help to keep us alive. And we now, over the last couple of decades, have gotten a much better appreciation for the role that microbes play as contributors to our own personal health, right? So besides, what we think of it as, typical human cells, right? Your skin, all of your major organs, we now know that, every one of us also has this incredible microbiome of all these microbes, on our skin, in our gut, in our teeth that ultimately are playing really critical and important roles in our daily functioning, right? So most of these microbes are not there to hurt you. They're actually essential for helping you digest your food, right? They're essential parts of your immune system. There's been an explosion of research that, shows all the different ways that our microbiome can influence things like mental health and neural function and all kinds of other things. So just like actually depend on these microbial helpers to help make us kind of who we are ultimately, our planet does the same thing, right? So microbes are kind of the metabolic engines that make life on Earth possible. So they're providing us with the oxygen that we're breathing right now. They're at the base of the ocean food web. These microbes are responsible for basically allowing all of those kind of larger organisms that you might typically think of as, sea life to be there. They play really important roles in these broad geochemical cycles of the planet, right? So recycling different nutrients like carbon and nitrogen and sulfur and phosphorus. They can break down pollutants, do all kinds of other really amazing things, right? So we really depend on these microbes to just be here and be alive on this planet. So if you zoom out to kind of really basic level, how are we all here? How are we making our living and getting our energy on this planet? Well, we're here thanks to the process of photosynthesis. So this is where different organisms like plants and algae and also phytoplankton in the ocean take carbon dioxide gas in the air, take water, and use energy from the sun to make plant matter, right? Different kind of organic carbon sugars, essentially. And as a byproduct, release oxygen, right? The oxygen that we breathe. So plants are using this photosynthetic process to make this oxygen, and then we as mammals can take that oxygen and use it to help, in combination with this plant matter, to get back that chemical energy that we use to power everything we do. And in the process, we release water and we release that carbon dioxide back out into the environment. So ultimately, all of the biomass, all the food that you eat for dinner, the material is coming ultimately from carbon dioxide gas in the from the atmosphere and energy from the sun, right? And then you're extracting that energy that ultimately was light energy to be able to go about your daily life. So essentially, everything derives from carbon dioxide in the air and the sun's energy, right, to make the plants. Whether you're eating the plants directly or if you're eating animals that have themselves eaten the plants, that's where that life is coming from. We are here because of photosynthesis. And so when you think of photosynthesis, right, you probably picture, trees, right? All the beautiful forests around us that are doing a major amount of this activity to provide us with that oxygen that we need. But when you think about the entire Earth system, half of all photosynthesis is actually happening in the ocean. So the oceans are doing just as much for us as all of the forests on land. In the ocean, though, what's doing that photosynthesis are organisms called phytoplankton, right? So these are photosynthetic organisms, often single-celled, that are sort of floating around in the ocean, collecting the sun's light energy and doing the same thing that plants are doing, right? They are taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and using it to make oxygen that we can then use, right? Something on the order of 50 billion tons of carbon every year is being cycled through these marine communities. To put that weight in perspective, right, it's essentially about 50 billion Volkswagen Beetles worth of carbon. So when we think about these organisms, these phytoplankton are a really diverse group of organisms, and they're really pretty. So here's just an idea of what some of these organisms look like under the microscope. A lot of them have these special kind of green, color that's these photosynthetic pigments that help them to actually absorb that light energy in the first place. But they come in all different shapes, all different sizes. It's really just, it's a treat to be able to look under the microscope at them and just see what's out there. So here's an animation of this chlorophyll, this photosynthetic pigment, and basically showing us kind of where this photosynthesis is happening on a global scale every year. So you can see kind of across these vast swaths of the global oceans, these, kind of green plumes kind of coming and going and moving kind of, from the equator to more latitudinal, more polar regions over time. But it's this really highly dynamic system, right, that is constantly churning, constant kind of birth and death of these cells, but that are ultimately, creating all this oxygen, right? All these areas across both the North Pole and the South Pole. So ultimately, we kind of think of these marine phytoplankton as kind of the invisible forests of the planet, right? So just like, again, the trees on land, all of these forests of tiny, tiny single-celled organisms are both producing this oxygen that we are all breathing right at the moment. So not only are these phytoplankton really diverse in terms of their shape, but the size range is really striking. So we have things like this organism called Emiliana huxleyi, up to kind of these giant trichodesmium combs that you can actually see with a naked eye. These are tiny cells, right? So we need microscopes to see most of these. They're on the order of a micron or something larger than that. To try and put that in perspective, that's the same kind of relative size scale as a killer whale is to all of Manhattan, right? So you have these just incredibly vast, almost kind of cities of microbes out there, just kind of floating around in the surface of the ocean across most of our planet, right? That are kind of just coexisting with these much tinier cells. And so, we've known about these for a long time, and being able to see these different kinds of beautiful phytoplankton out there in the oceans. And then in 1979, John Waterbury, who was at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and colleagues made this really amazing discovery that, in sort of the background of a lot of these giant, beautiful phytoplankton were some even smaller cells, these single-celled cyanobacteria called Synechococcus. And then fast forward a few years later, other researchers discovered these even tinier cells that were out there in the ocean, far less than a micron in diameter, that would just sort of show up almost as sort of kind of this noise, these dots in the background of these images. But these cells had these same kind of photosynthetic pigments that these other kinds of cells did, different kinds of chlorophyll, very related to kind of what makes trees green on land. And so this discovery extended kind of the size range by an extra order of magnitude, right? So we now know that kind of the total diversity of these things, across these scales of different microbes in the ocean is against the same as comparing, one fish to, again, all of Manhattan or something of that size, a whole city. So this really, really, really tiny cell that was discovered in the mid 80s was later named Prochlorococcus. And it turns out to be the single most abundant photosynthetic organism on the planet. So this is an electron micrograph image of these cells. Again, false color. They're not quite this color, but actually not too far off, as I'll show you in a second. So how many of these things are there? There's 3 billion Prochlorococcus out there in the global oceans. It's 3 times 10 to the 27th cells. That is just an unimaginably large number. If you try and picture how many things that is, your head really should hurt quite a lot because it's a just giant, giant value. So if we look at where Prochlorococcus is found on the planet, all the areas where there's colors here in this map are regions where Prochlorococcus is found. So they don't go quite to the cold waters of the North and South Pole, but throughout the mid-latitude oceans, they can make up to half the phytoplankton biomass in some regions. Right? So especially in these vast open ocean regions of kind of the oligotrophic North Pacific and South Pacific and into the Atlantic and parts of the Indian Ocean. If you take the global population of Prochlorococcus, the back of the envelope calculation suggests that weighs something on the order of 1 billion humans, right? So there's a ton of these cells out there. So what is this? Well, it's kind of a single species, as well as we can actually really define them in microbial space. It's a cyanobacterium. It's what used to be called a blue-green algae. So under the microscope, they just look something like this. But what it ends up being is essentially what we think of as the minimal photosynthetic unit. Right? They're the smallest free-living cell that can do oxygenic photosynthesis, on its own. Here's another electron micrograph image of these cells. The smallest get down to about 600 nanometers in size, which means that 100 of these cells laid end to end would be about the same width as a human hair. They're so small, they're actually kind of similarly sized to the wavelength of the light that they're actually absorbing. And so we can grow them in the lab, and they all have this really beautiful light green color, which comes from the specific divinyl chlorophyll molecule that these cells carry that helps them to harvest that light energy. So Prochlorococcus lives out in the middle of the open ocean. What is that world kind of like for a cell out there? So we kind of when we think of kind of oceanography terms, I'm sort of showing an image from the surface of the ocean, kind of down to the top, roughly 200 meters of the ocean, which is about as deep as light can penetrate. So in the surface of the ocean, it's actually very mixed. So you have lots of wind and other factors that are helping to sort of, mix that surface water up a lot. But then as you go deeper and deeper into the ocean, you see light intensity drop off quite a bit. It gets much colder, and it also becomes an area where there's more nutrients. So Prochlorococcus has really figured out evolutionarily over the years how to thrive in very low nutrient environments way out in the middle of the open ocean. But it's a very dynamic environment out there. It's not only an area with all these different gradients of different kinds of light and nutrients and temperature and other kinds of conditions that these cells have to contend with. But there's other organisms out there, right? So there's this whole other biological world of other cells that these cells interact with. It's a very dynamic environment. These cells are dividing in half every couple of days. They're eaten kind of at that same rate. So this whole 10 to the 27th cell population is turning over fairly frequently. They're being eaten by bigger cells, which then go on to feed other cells and so on. It's also very dilute. So when we think about the nutrients out there in the oceans, these cells can be hundreds of body lengths away from their nearest neighbor, and even multiple body lengths away from the next individual atom of a particular nutrient. So these cells can have as few as 1,700 different genes in their genome. But every time we find new lineages at different parts of the ocean, we find hundreds of new genes that were not in a different cell. So, you and I, all humans share, for the most part, most of the same genes. Obviously, we're all slightly different. We have slightly different variants of the same genes, right? Someone may have brown hair versus blonde hair or so on, but we're generally similar. Prochlorococcus cells, by contrast, can have completely different abilities than other cells that are actually very, very otherwise closely related. Maybe they can eat a completely different food that another cell can't. Overall, when we start trying to do these projections, this global Prochlorococcus collective may have something on the order of 80,000 different genes that allow it to survive across different parts of our planet. By contrast, humans have something on the order of 21,000 genes, right? So each individual cell is tiny, but as kind of a collective group, there's just an amazing amount of diversity out there. And ultimately, we think that that diversity, helps them to survive in all these different regions of the ocean, right? So strains in the surface ocean are actually quite different from strains in the deep water. There's thousands of these different variants that are all just slightly different from one another, right? Cells in the Atlantic Ocean are actually a little bit different from cells in the Pacific Ocean, and so on. Despite all this diversity and the fact that these cells are growing and dying, every day, overall, it's a remarkably stable system, right? So when people look at how many cells there are off a particular site in Bermuda, for instance, on yearly basis, we see kind of these really fairly reproducible cycles. So there's an amazing stability to this system that helps it to function and provide all these ecosystem services. So ultimately, we've got these 3 billion cells out there in the ocean that are a major component of the marine food web, right? So again, they're doing photosynthesis. They're using that sunlight energy to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, make oxygen for us. A lot of that material that they then produce through photosynthesis, called dissolved organic carbon, can either kind of settle down and kind of sink down into the deep ocean, which is kind of one way through which the oceans are helping us deal with climate change by kind of taking some of that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and kind of basically burying it in the deep ocean. But a lot of it also just goes to feed other cells, right? And then ultimately, those cells get eaten by bigger cells, which ultimately get eaten by, things like fish, and then, can potentially come to us. So when you consider how important Prochlorococcus is for ocean photosynthesis, and then you also think about how important the oceans are for, making the oxygen that we breathe, you can ultimately thank this tiny cell, right, for something like every 10th breath or so that you take. Right? So no matter where you are on the planet, Prochlorococcus is providing just this basic fundamental service to us that we kind of take for granted, right? That there's going to be oxygen for us to breathe. But it's only there because of these really amazing different organisms, both on land and in the ocean, doing that for us. So over billions of years, phytoplankton, put this oxygen into our atmosphere, and ultimately they helped make fossil fuel, right? So a lot of the, fossil fuels came actually from just buried phytoplankton. And so, as we have been, taking those fossil fuels and then burning them back into to power, things in our society, we're releasing that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, something on the order of 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide each year, which is really fundamentally changing sort of the balance of the global carbon cycle. When you sort of put these numbers in perspective with how much normal turnover of both land plants and ocean plants are helping us to process this carbon. So what we see, right, is here's a measurements of carbon dioxide concentrations in Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, right? So these carbon dioxide concentrations have been rising very steadily over the years, right? So we're doing more of this respiration, right? We're burning this food, right, and fibers. We're making more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we also see that oxygen is decreasing in the atmosphere, right? So as people at Scripps Institute of Oceanography have been, measuring this also for many years, and we see that there's less of this oxygen, around in the atmosphere over the last couple of decades. So, we know the Earth is always changing, right? So when we think back to kind of the birth of the Earth and think about all the different changes and sort of, spiral around through this diagram, through the Precambrian era to, the age of dinosaurs, right? Humans first show up somewhere around here, the Holocene period, roughly 10,000 years ago, right? The Earth is a dynamic system. The Earth has been changing constantly, and things like Prochlorococcus and other cyanobacteria have helped with many of these transitions by providing oxygen, right, that didn't really exist when Earth first formed to allow us to be here, right? But the timescales matter, right? So we are changing these systems and putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at just an incredibly rapid rate. So here's kind of looking over time, kind of estimates of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and human population size, where we see this incredibly rapid advance over the last many, centuries or even decades. In some cases, things were really rapidly changing. Correspondingly, right, we've seen these global temperature trends increasing over the last many years, right? We know the planet's getting warmer due to all of our actions. And ultimately, all of this is affecting the oceans, right? And so the oceans have been doing a lot of good for us on this front. We estimate that oceans have absorbed about 25% of these anthropogenic CO2 emissions and over 90% of that excess heat that we've created. So essentially, our atmosphere would be in a much different place, much worse place if it wasn't for the oceans pulling some of this material in, pulling in that heat, and helping to buffer some of that change. That being said, that's come at a huge cost for our oceans, right? Which has implications that I'll talk about now for all these different kinds of organisms that ultimately, no matter where you are, you rely on to survive, right? So we've warmed the oceans. That has also led to there being less oxygen in the oceans. We've made the oceans more acidic. This has had implications for changing in ocean mixing and ocean currents and all kinds of other things. So we kind of talk about those in detail a little bit more. Ultimately, all this is, as I just showed, happening really quickly. And so, the question is, can organisms adapt? Will these organisms adapt? What will kind of these future oceans that we all rely on sort of look like? So one thing we know is that human activity is decreasing the amount of oxygen in the oceans, right? So warm water just holds less oxygen, right? So in this map shows kind of these regions, the colored are regions that we term oxygen minimum zones, right? Areas where there's essentially not enough oxygen for, things that need oxygen to be able to survive. So this changes microbial communities. It changes the way some of these microbial communities produce greenhouse active gases like nitrous oxide and all kinds of other feedbacks that scientists are now starting to try and understand. So I mentioned the oceans are becoming more acidic, right? So as more carbon dioxide goes in the atmosphere, more of that gets absorbed into the oceans, and then through some different chemical reactions, the pH of the oceans are becoming more acidic, right? More like vinegar or lemon juice, right? And this damages shellfish. It damages corals. It affects the growth of microbes, and it can also alter photosynthesis. People are looking heavily into this. The impacts of this can vary a lot among different kinds of phytoplankton. Many of you are probably familiar with this idea of harmful algal blooms, right? So this is where, typically caused by excess nutrients. So different kinds of fertilizers or, different kinds of detergents that people might use that run off into our waterways and provide excess nutrients that wouldn't normally be there that allow different kinds of algae to bloom, right? That can, some of these also produce toxins, right? That can make seafood collected from a particular area unsafe, can impact other ocean life, can basically suck up other nutrients and oxygen from these environments. So either directly impacting human health or impacting some of those other microbes that, again, we rely on for our health, right? So, here's an example, right? We've seen these kinds of things. So here's New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, right? It has this constant, data board where they're mapping where it is safe or unsafe to swim, right? What kinds of active warnings are there for these different harmful algal blooms, right? All of this is really due to human impacts on these waterways. We're also in through a lot of these climate impacts, making the oceans darker. So, different studies have shown that the amount of light that goes into parts of the ocean is changing. So over the past couple of decades, more than 20% of the world's ocean has actually gotten darker, right? So there's less light coming in for these photosynthetic cells to be able to use to drive this fundamental process of photosynthesis that we all rely on. Other parts of it have been getting lighter as well. This can be caused from, sediment runoff, right? So you get all that kind of silt and stuff running off into the oceans, and that can make the water more cloudy. Some of these algal blooms, rising temperatures, and changes in mixing and stratification can also do that. Ultimately, this is changing habitats, and photosynthesis rates and other things, but in ways that we're only just starting to try and study to understand. More directly, right, as people interested in human health, climate change can impact the spread of infectious diseases as well, right? So there's all kinds of different naturally occurring hazards, different kinds of microbial pathogens that as we change the nutrients in the water, as the oceans get warmer, we're changing the distribution of where these microbes can be found, which can change who is at risk, right? So either someone goes out swimming and becomes introduced to new pathogens and hazards they wouldn't have otherwise in the absence of climate change, or all through zoonotic transfers, right? Where, something first goes to an animal and then eventually through, evolutionary selection, maybe can then make the jump to us. Environmental stressors, right? Increased heat and, exhaustion, other things like that that affect, our body can also change in some ways our susceptibility to some of these pathogens. We've seen this actually very recently. If you happen to hear in this news, there were a number of articles about, not too far away in Cape Cod, a swimmer that was infected with a rare bacterium called Vibrio vulnificus, or kind of flesh-eating microbe that in at a beach in Falmouth. This is something that is very unfortunate and very tragic. But when the headlines call this a rare bacteria, the problem is it's probably not going to be rare forever around here. So this is something that has been a concern for residents of the Gulf Coast for many years. But people have been predicting that with increased water temperatures, these regions of, or the range in which this vulnificus pathogen can be found is very much expected to extend, depending on, what, and how bad things get in terms of climate disturbances, potentially certainly up into the New Hampshire coastline or maybe even beyond. So this may be something that, we now have to kind of contend with more regularly. So what's going to happen to Prochlorococcus in the future? Well, we don't know for sure. People are trying to project these impacts on ocean microbes. Overall, these billion cells aren't going to go away, but they're going to change for certain. So we think that their overall numbers may actually increase because as the polar waters get warmer, that may actually allow these cells to be able to extend their range and kind of thrive over a larger part of the ocean. But total ocean phytoplankton biomass is actually predicted to net decline, right? Which actually has to do more with the input of other nutrients into the oceans changing, which again, when we rely on that for half of our oxygen, that has some really fundamental challenges to what that might mean for life across the planet. Other things like plastics, microplastics in the ocean, and other things may be affecting these microbes as well. So ultimately, moving forward, we have to kind of think about how to, be better stewards of our planet on all kinds of scales, which includes being aware of these microbial resources. So, from kind of these One Health paradigms that really, think about, our health as, a function of environmental health, the microbes are a real important part of that, right? And, we need to start recognizing the importance of these organisms for public health, environmental protection, agriculture, and other kinds of policy decisions that we make. It's hard to think about kind of safeguarding and preserving the ocean microbiome. How do you think about getting people invested in something that they can't see, right? That's really hard. A few years ago, the World Wildlife Federation put out this image, which I really like, which, was kind of thinking about this idea of ocean conservation, even for big things like tuna, and asking, would people care more about sort of the social life if it was a panda, right? If you put these panda masks on. How do we do that for things that we can't even see, but are an essential part of who we are on this planet? Moving forward, first of all, we need more research into this. We don't really understand what we have now. It's hard to go out and kind of sample these things across just the vastness of the ocean. We've only mapped a tiny fraction of that. What else can we do? Well, first thing is reducing carbon emissions, right? So every little bit that we don't put into the atmosphere is something that, we don't have to then try and mitigate down the road, or that, will help to slow the rate of change in the oceans. Minimizing pollution and runoff, thinking about protecting these ecosystems, right? Thinking about how to value the microbial contributions of our oceans and not just worry about how many fish are we going to get out of a region, but what are these other ecosystem services that we rely on for our health? How do we value and put a number on that is something that we also need to consider. Microbes can also be great bioindicators, right? Sort of the proverbial canary in the coal mine. Microbes are going to change faster than other kinds of organisms, and we can kind of use those to help better understand and keep an eye out for where things are changing. We can also kind of harness these things as factories of things like protein, fuels, other kinds of industrially valuable products. Could we just make them using sunlight? That would be a lot better than a lot of the approaches we use right now. Microbes can certainly play an important role in improving sustainable aquaculture, right? Trying to improve the ways that we, get our food in a more sustainable way. We can use these things and keep, valuing their potential role as a source of pharmaceuticals, right? Lots of drugs on the market originally derived from natural products, from things we got from, the plants, or antibiotics that came from soil microbes. The oceans are a huge source of that as well. And microbes can also potentially help us to kind of clean up and remediate, kind of polluted areas. And so there's a lot of work going into that as well. So ultimately, there are efforts that are in place to try and, think about how we can, value and use these plankton-based solutions to think about addressing global crises of biodiversity and, climate issues and pollution issues that ultimately are, there to make life better for us and everything else on this planet. So I'll end there and just try and, hope that I least very briefly convinced you that ocean microbes are actually our allies in global health, in climate change. The oceans are not something that's just sort of separate or that, you may only get to visit them occasionally, but even so, they're still important for your basic survival on the planet. Ocean health is an important environment, important determinant of human health. And it's things like this organism, Prochlorococcus, and many, many other things out there in the ocean that are helping us to, be here on Earth and making that oxygen that you're breathing right now. And just keep in mind these invisible forests of the oceans and try not to take all these things, even though you can't see them, try not to take them for granted. Uh, and so I'll stop there. Thank some of the groups that have supported work in my research lab over the last few years, and I'm happy to take questions or comments. Otherwise, I'm also happy to answer questions that might pop in your head later by email at this email address here. Thank you all for taking some time out of your day to hear this.
Steven, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I don't have any in the chat. If you have any questions, just unmute yourself and speak, and hopefully we won't have too much overlap there.
Steve, thanks again for a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I do have some questions for you. It's my understanding that cyanobacteria were one of the first organisms on Earth, and they're about 2 billion years old. And I think it's believed that some of the cyanobacteria in Shark Bay off the western coast of Australia are these original 2 billion-year-old cyanobacteria. I was wondering if Prochlorococcus is very closely related to these earlier organisms, or whether they're really a long way off and have genetically evolved from them.
Yeah, so Prochlorococcus is a large group. They, have diverged from other kinds of cyanobacteria. There's lots of different kinds of cyanobacteria on the planet. So, some of these early stromatolite kind of fossil views of early cyanobacteria are not as best as we can try and reconstruct kind of the evolutionary history. They're different from Prochlorococcus for certain. They all share some fundamental features of being able to do photosynthesis. These came a little bit later, but the rise, it's a little bit hard to put specifics on some of these very ancient datings. But Prochlorococcus has unquestionably over many billions of years helped to provide a lot of the oxygen in our atmosphere. They may not have been the very first ones. They've actually their most recent common ancestor, they've actually sort of lost a lot of genes evolutionarily from kind of their ancestors. But as a group, they're all doing these same basic functions.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else have any questions that they'd
Steven,
like to ask Steve?
I had some internet from, is that protococcus, is it increasing or decreasing?
So we like right now on Earth, there's sort of these yearly cycles, right, where these cells, sort of grow and die a little bit over daily scales and also kind of over the span of a year. Um, we think, trying to project forward in doing modeling efforts, we think that there'll be more of these cells probably, in a future warmer ocean mostly because they'll be able to sort of move into warmer waters where they currently don't grow very well. But there's a lot of uncertainties about that right now.
Okay, so the color, is it a good guy or a bad guy?
Prochlorococcus is a good guy or bad guy? Is that the question?
Yes.
I think they're good. They are doing things, they're an essential part of the ocean food web. They're an essential part of, doing global photosynthesis. We would be in a very different place without them.
Thank you.
They're helping you. If you're out there swimming, in the middle of the ocean and you swallow a bunch of Prochlorococcus, they're not going to do anything to you.
Okay.
I'm wondering about their functioning rate. Is it possible to study, or do we have any evidence of whether their rate of cycling is increasing or decreasing as the ocean becomes warmer and more acidic and darker?
Yeah, people are doing studies of that kind of in the lab, so we can take, some of these cells out of the ocean and, bring them into the lab and do experiments. And, certainly all of these factors impact Prochlorococcus in different ways. It gets a little bit harder out in the oceans, right? The environment is messy and complicated, and that's, what's so extraordinary about it. But it's we don't fully know, what the sort of normal variation is. And, we've seen some changes, but whether those are, small blips due to other kinds of confounding factors or actual trends is still a little bit early to say right now.
I'm thinking of the growing population, human population on Earth, uh,
Mhm.
which to me would translate into Prochlorococcus having to do more work out there to keep up the oxygen balance. Does that follow, or am I missing something in the
Well,
story?
there's only so much that these cells can do. So there's kind of a certain, maximum rate at which they can do photosynthesis. So just because, we, are, whether it's all of us, breathing out more carbon dioxide or burning fossil fuels and putting more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, certainly these cells have not been able to sort of just keep that at bay. We see clearly that the atmospheric carbon dioxide is increasing. So, there's only so far we can push these systems. There's only so much. There's, things limiting their growth that are basically constraining how much more they can kind of do for us on that front.
And do they get sick the way we do? Are there things that kill them?
So there's lots of things that kill them. So there's viruses that can infect and sort of blow up these cells essentially and lyse them. And there's also, they can just sort of get eaten. And they can also, sort of, if you want to consider it sort of sick and not in a traditional pathogen sense, but they can be affected by, either having too many nutrients, right? So it can become toxic, kind of things to them to have lots of like heavy metals or too many nutrients can actually, make them not grow as well. Um, but a lot of those things, like the viruses, are actually really important for the overall system. So Prochlorococcus are dying constantly, but it's this kind of turnover, this growth and death that is actually, that when all these cells die and release all of their contents out of the ocean, that's actually a really important way through which all the other things are getting that material that Prochlorococcus has made. So that sort of birth and death cycle is actually very essential to the ocean carbon cycle. But that being said, again, yes, there are things that will change their ability to do all of that.
I
Steve,
had
do
a
you know if
question.
there are there any bioengineers trying to work on Prochlorococcus or any other microbes as a carbon capture method to, figure out how to increase their numbers?
Yeah, well, yeah, that gets into sort of almost some, geoengineering research. So there have been efforts over the years to sort of study what would happen if, something like, adding a lot of iron to the ocean, right? With the idea where a lot of these cells are, their growth can be in certain parts of the ocean limited by iron. What ends up happening, right? So this has been sort of touted as kind of a way to solve all of our climate problem, right? If we just dump a bunch of iron in the ocean, we'll, make all these cells grow, and then they'll do more photosynthesis and pull all that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There are many, many problems with this, not the least of which is that it doesn't really work well because even when you dump that iron into the ocean, you can stimulate growth, but those cells are then going to just, again, die off and release all that carbon back into the environment. And that just makes its way right back into the atmosphere. And in the meantime, what you've done is caused all kinds of other problems to the surrounding ecosystem and thrown off a lot of the balance. So, there are ways in which, in the future, kind of messing with ways to kind of, increase the efficiency of this microbial carbon pump. or even more abiotic carbon pumps may help a little bit. But until we stop putting, 40 some odd billion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what we are going to actually be able to do through these kinds of manipulations is such a drop in the bucket. It's not going to be the cure.
Any other questions? Oh,
Yeah, I have a question.
Joanne.
Joanne, sorry. On the West Coast where you saw those zones, can you expand, like, what does that mean for the health of other species? Because you said it sounded like some of these get eaten by other species. So the West Coast in Mexico, can you just expand the
Oh, you
impact
talk
on
about
that?
sort of those oxygen minimum zones where,
Yeah,
so yeah, those areas have been growing. So scientists have been documenting, these regions that have very, very low oxygen are expanding, and they
right.
are absolutely changing microbial communities in there, and also, that has spillover effects onto kind of what kinds of larger organisms, can make their living there. So we see very large changes in sort of the ecosystem processes, happening in those minimum zones.
Yikes. So what does, some of your images were from satellites, and there's talk of two of NOAA's premier satellites being dismantled or disengaged. Is this stuff how are scientists going to do their work if they're doing those kinds of things in the name of denying climate?
It's a very profound challenge, for sure. We rely on, those sorts of satellite images for all kinds of studies, right? The US taxpayers already paid for those
Right,
satellites, already put them up there, right? This is already a resource that, that's supposed to be available to all of us. Just, getting rid of it doesn't seem to serve any real, cost saving efficiency increase. So, it's not just satellite images that we rely on.
right,
It's, there's all these different floats that are sort of drifting around the ocean, sending data back to help us, get out there.
right,
There is, a large oceanographic research fleet in the US, to take, scientists out to different parts of the Pacific Ocean where they can do much more involved experiments that we can't do just with satellites or with sort of these autonomous kind of floats. And so, yeah, we're in a very challenging time for trying to figure out how to keep doing the science and still move all this forward because climate change is happening, and if we're just ignoring it, we're not gonna understand what's going on and have a better way to figure out how to deal with it and
address
know
it.
what's
Yeah,
coming, be prepared.
this is very interesting. Thanks for all your work on this.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.